Good evening, everyone. My name is Henry Giroux, and I want to begin by first of all, I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that McMaster University is situated on the traditional territories of the Masaga and Haudenosaunee nations within the lands protected by the Dish with Open Spoon Wampum Agreement. Secondly, Professor Don Abelson and I want to extend a warm welcome to Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. and express our gratitude for his participation in our inaugural speaker series, Higher Education and the Role of Intellectuals in a Time of Crisis, a series co-hosted with the support of the McMaster Center for Scholarship in the Public Interest and Wilson College. Of course, these events are never done with a few individuals, and so we would like to thank Christy Caricato, Zachary Gantz, Colin Zaneta, and Melissa Hennick. Now, before Professor Glaude speaks, I want to provide an introduction that I hope will offer somewhat, at least, an informed context for his talk tonight. This lecture is founded on the belief that higher education must reclaim its place as a haven for critical thought, academic freedom, and for fostering the public good. In an era that calls for critically literate citizenry capable of preserving and fostering the common good, higher education must not merely serve private interests, but stand boldly as a defender and enabler of democratic values, truth, and a commitment to equality, social justice, and academic freedom. In an era of collapsing visions, emotional plagues, manufactured ignorance, and staggering inequality, environmental ruin, human misery, and rising authoritarianism, it's vital for academics to affirm higher education's claim to democracy. Above all, academics need to stand firm in their ethical convictions, engage with pressing social issues of our time, and bridge the gap between learning and everyday life. Invoking the spirit of James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, Edward Said, Ellen Willis, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, and others, we believe it's our role as educators and citizens to champion public intellectuals who boldly challenge power, ground their own work in alleviating human suffering, and defy the moral void and terrifying pull of ultranationalism, white supremacy, and staggering economic inequality. Embracing this project, intellectuals transcend the narrow confines of academic disciplines, engaging with society's most urgent struggles. They resist the commercialization that threatens to reduce education to mere job training, and instead they stand with courage and an unspeakable, unbreakable commitment to justice, bringing truth to light amid dark clouds cast by lies, conspiracy theories, and vacuous spectacles. As moral witnesses, they affirm the words of Keith Macabre-Lohman, who says the connection between a reflective sense of self and a broader notion of responsibility is more urgent than ever. At stake here is the recognition that without an informed public, there can be no democracy, and without a language critical of injustice, there can be no justice. Today, the role of educators as public intellectuals has never been more vital, especially when far-right extremists are on the run. Education, as Professor Glaude reminds us, has always been intertwined with politics. It's not merely a means to transfer knowledge or a method, but a site of struggle over agency, identity, history, and the future. In a time when education can become a tool of oppression, manifest in policies that ban books, of course, censor academics. It can also, it seems to me, or to put it more specifically, restrict what can be taught and recast history through the lens of white nationalism. Professor Glaude offers a powerful counter-narrative. His work urges us to imagine education as a vibrant practice of freedom, a living pathway towards a strong and vibrant democracy. He invites us into a profound dialogue with history. I can't stress this enough. A commitment to honoring the memories of the forgotten, the silenced, and the oppressed as part of a relentless pursuit to hold power accountable. And through this, he reveals the deep currents of repression and exploitation, illuminating the pathways of resistance. Simultaneously, he offers a vision of leadership that amplifies the power of both individual and collective agency, a fierce binding force that calls us to the obligations of social responsibility, justice, and freedom. It's a foundation for a democracy that pulsates with the promise of a future where economic, social, and personal rights are not merely ideals, but live realities, untouched by fear, repression, or the shifting, ever-present ghost of fascism. Professor Glaude's book, We Are Leaders, we are the leaders we have been looking for, calls us to embrace a form of prophetic leadership that is grounded in the experiences of ordinary people, insisting that we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable society. He challenges the traditional view of prophets as distant figures and instead emphasizes a democratized prophetic approach where the capacity to envision new possibilities is within all of us. He argues that especially in times of moral and political crisis, it's essential to bring the prophetic down to the ground, to see ourselves as agents of change, capable of challenging injustice and transforming our communities. He writes, we must be skeptical of those who claim to possess the truth and urges all of us to follow them. Instead, we should see ourselves, as Ella Baker insisted, as the leaders we have been looking for. His vision of prophetic leadership is not about waiting for a hero, but about cultivating the courage and imagination necessary to address, all of us, to address the deep injustices of our time. This stance resonates powerfully amid today's battles against white supremacy, economic inequality, and political repression. His call is a fierce reminder that the future of democracy hinges on our resolve to engage boldly and creatively, to defy entrenched powers, and to dream of new ways of being in the world. I must share a personal note at this point in my conclusion. Eddie is not only a courageous and brilliant thinker, he's above all a writer's writer. His prose sings, lyrical, poetic, ablaze with a passion that educates, inspires, and uplifts. And every time I immerse myself in his words, I'm not only moved, but transformed, discovering a deeper understanding of the power of conviction, the awakening of consciousness, and the profound agency that rises from the struggle for a more just world. Allow me to share a passage from his groundbreaking book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking for, which I believe captures the very heart of his voice and his vision. He writes, mine is a faith that if we act intelligently and with imagination, we can change ourselves and our world for the better. But the outcomes are not guaranteed and are often provisional. The world is a fraught and vexing place, precarious and perilous, with a history that is a thicket of thorns. Acting in such a world is no sunny walk in the park. As James Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. Professor Claude, the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, stands as one of America's foremost scholars and voices on race, democracy, and religion. His scholarship has deeply reshaped public discourse, inviting us, quote, to imagine ourselves being together differently, to make plain the ravages of memory, and to grapple with the ghost of our history, so we may reimagine and strive towards a most just future. Among his most recent works, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America, and of course, We Are the Leaders We Have Been looking for, which resonate as, in my estimation, as essential guides for our time. It's both a pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Glaude to our lecture series tonight.
I am overwhelmed. Thank you so much. I've been reading you, Dr. Giroux, for so long, and to have you say that about my work, given how you have provided an example for what it means to understand the importance of learning and the workings of everyday life in the pursuit of a more just world. Just mind-blowing. I'm thankful on every level. I want to thank all the folks behind the scenes that are making this event possible. I want to thank Professor Abelson and Professor Giroux for thinking of me. I'm really overwhelmed, to be honest with you. So let me just jump into this before I'm going to call my mother and tell her how wonderful, because she knows how important you are to my intellectual development, Doc. And so I'm going to call my mom. I'm so country, I know. But anyway, let me just jump into to the talk so we can have conversation. American pragmatists have often found themselves grappling with the subject, and it is sometimes a vexing subject, of religion. We contend with its truth claims as well as attempt to account for the experiences with empathy or skepticism that often fall under the category's description. And we do so in light of commitments that define philosophical pragmatism. William James powerfully describes the pragmatist as one who, quotes, turns away from abstraction and insufficiency, from verbal solutions, from bad a priori reasons, from fixed principles, closed systems, and pretended absolutes and origins. He turns towards concreteness and adequacy, towards facts, towards action, and towards power. It means the open air and possibilities of nature as against dogma, artificiality, and the pretense of finality, end quote. The good pragmatist then encourages a view of philosophy where the neat conundrums of our professional practice give way to a certain kind of responsibility in our intellectual lives, where we take the tools of our training and work to offer insight, however limited, into the specific conditions of value and into the specific consequences of ideas in the pursuit of a more just world. On this view, philosophy, as John Dewey argued, philosophy becomes criticism of, quote, the influential beliefs that underlie culture, criticism which transcends the beliefs to their generating conditions as far as may be, which tracks them to their results, which considers the mutual compatibility of the elements of the total structure of belief. Such an examination, Dewey goes on to say, terminates, whether so intended or not, in a projection of them into a new perspective, which leads to new surveys of possibilities. The pragmatist descends from the abstraction into the messiness of experience. And of course, I use messiness in the light of how Samuel Beckett understood the word. So pragmatism places an accent on an open, malleable, and pluralistic universe, a view in which change is a central feature of our living, demanding of us variety, imagination, and experimentation in practical matters. The late Richard Rorty might have given us the most radical rendering of this sensibility, quote, the sense that there is nothing deep down inside us except that what we have put there ourselves. No criterion that we have not created in the course of creating a practice, no standard of rationality that is not an appeal to such a criterion, no rigorous argumentation that is not obedience to our own conventions, end quote. No wonder the subject of religion, in light of all of this, can be so vexing for us pragmatists. From Peirce's 1893 essay, Evolutionary Love, to William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, to John Dewey's A Common Faith, to Richard Rorty's Polytheism, to Cornel West's Prophetic Pragmatism, a decidedly male affair, yes? There's a rich body of literature on a pragmatic approach to religion. In my own work, I've tried to think pragmatically about African-American religion. For example, I've always had an ambivalent relation to Dewey's book, A Common Faith, not because I disagree with the argument of the book. In fact, by most accounts, I would consider myself a pragmatic religious naturalist in the Deweyan vein. I find this separation of the religious from the supernatural compelling, and I am more than convinced that the religious quality of experience, that is, the fundamental reordering of the will evidenced in our adjustment to some particular experience rooted in the creative workings of the imagination. I'm fundamentally committed that that can be had apart from religions of any sort. I remember as a graduate student shouting with a loud yes when I first read these words from John Dewey's A Common Faith, quote, "They, theists and their kin, will have to ask as far as they nominally believe in the need for radical social change, whether what they accomplish when they point with one hand to the seriousness of present evils is not undone when the other hand points away from men and nature for their remedy," end quote. Perhaps this was an adolescent rebellion against my indebtedness to my teacher, Cornel West. With Dewey, our salvation or damnation remains always in our hands. It is our responsibility, our cross to bear. And we take it up with the idea that we are a part of a communion of fellows with passionate commitments that reach back to a distant past and extends forward to generations to come. As he writes, that is Dewey, ours, quote, is the responsibility of conserving, transmitting, rectifying, and expanding the heritage of values we have received, that those who come after us may receive it more solid and secure, more widely accessible, and more generally shared than we have received it, end quote. His, and by extension mine, is a practical faith in ideal ends, a faith that lights up our imaginations and convicts us to act in pursuit of those ends. But my ambivalence with the common faith rests in my sense, a deeply felt and personal sense, I must add, that religious impulses often reside in the need for consolation, that sense of helplessness in the face of uncertainty and loss. And here, passionate critical intelligence only takes us so far. Obviously, William James hovers in the background, as well as the particular tradition out of which I come. I find James compelling not so much because I find his talk of religious experience convincing. I don't. I do not hold the view that religious experience singles out anything unique in experience, but the place from which James takes up the question, this sense that all cannot end in shipwreck, this idea that for some, the religion of the sick soul, as he writes, the real core of the religious problem is this cry for help. Help. That speaks to me profoundly because of my own intimate relationship with loss and because of the fact, and it is a disconcerting fact indeed, that the people to whom I belong have had to grapple with loss as a fundamental feature of our sojourn in this nation. What does it mean to be a blues people? What does it mean to have faith in one's own capacities? To insist that we descend into the muck and the messiness of human experience, but to understand that we also need resources to hold on in the face of it, from whence the strenuous mood when life is beating one up daily. It's from this vantage point that I take up the problem of the prophetic in the context of our democratic practices, particularly in moments of crisis and need, the need for some model of courage or example of imaginative breakthrough. Now, I've written in We Are the Leaders we've been looking for, traditional understandings of the prophet often carry us into a somewhat enchanted world, in which unique or gifted persons offer a glimpse of what is to come in light of our current failings. They dazzle us with the power of their conviction and bind us through public exhortation to a vision of who we really are and of what we have tragically become. I don't think of the prophet as a professional of any sort. Theirs is a task rooted, even if reluctantly embraced, in the immediacy of convictions held and the implications of our current doings, not in some routinized practice with its own internal standards of excellence. That would be a bit odd. A guild of prophets would or should warrant immediate suspicion. Prophets profess and exhort with the aim of changing minds and behavior, not with the hopes of demonstrating competence. The prophet speaks, to borrow a phrase from Matthew Arnold, with fire and strength on behalf of someone or something, be it God, be it nation or muse. Her authority does not derive from some inner source or from acquired expertise. The fact that she has been chosen has little to do with her innate talents, but instead her authority springs from the outside, from that which carries the force to compel us or those who would listen and most often don't listen, to act otherwise. Now, for me, this raises serious concerns for democratic life. Prophets understood in this way aren't interested in being convinced that they are wrong. They are charged to dispense the truth. Their modes of address are typically declarative and imperative. In its most recognizable sense, prophets are the central characters in a divinely sanctioned vocation. As Nicholas Wolterstorff puts it, quote, "The prophet is one who speaks in the name of God, and as a consequence, those who hear the prophet speaking, when he is speaking in his prophetic capacity, are confronted with that which counts as God speaking. The utterance of God is not something a person just undertakes to do. God raises up the prophet as God raised up Moses," end quote. Now, obviously, this is not a mode of speech conducive to democratic deliberation, right, or commensurate with the exercise of public reason. The prophet was the individual, according to Abraham Joshua Heschel. The prophet was the individual who said no to his society, condemning habits and assumptions, its complacency, waywardness, and syncretism, end quote. For some, this passionate way of talking is to use Richard Rorty's language, a kind of conversation stopper. But prophetic speech involves more than forceful declarations. It presupposes a background of relations and agreements that make such speech possible. And in this sense, the work of the prophet is decidedly social. The prophet doesn't get her authority simply from from a force outside of us. The prophet's authority comes from the conversation within which she is engaged. Her mode of address is always preceded by other words and is a response to practices and express values that we call our own. Mutuality and shared experience add force and significance to our words. Ideally, in the prophet's company, we come to know and feel something about ourselves and about the arrangements within which we live, not just simply God's word. A renewed sense of connection emerges, a heightened feeling of disdain. In short, the prophet, as Ralph Waldo Emerson says of great men, is the color in to clear our eyes so that we might see the vices and follies that block the way to substantive change. Prophets reconstruct our vision, our way of seeing, right? And it is in the context of common complaint within community that the prophetic figure can experience the full force of established powers, and that we, as witnesses, attribute to them either madness or courage as they continue to enact their charge, irrespective of the consequences. So as I wrote in We Are the Leaders, prophets stand on the border of the heroic and the heretical. And in each instance, even if a few disagree with their actions, something beautiful is witnessed in their piety and in the virtue of courage exhibited in their willingness to risk everything. Now, my view of the prophetic should be thought of, I think, in a romantic register. Not so much a concern about an outside authority that justifies certain speech of a charismatic figure who by some magical gift or blessing has insight into the order of things. Instead, I see the prophetic as a feature of the exercise of what John Dewey called critical intelligence. Critical intelligence enacted in the context of inquiry. Critical intelligence central to democracy itself. Not so much about speech aimed to convince others, but decisions of conduct. Decisions of conduct that do not require a special gift of insight or foresight or an unmediated connection with a higher source that commands us to speak or act on behalf of divinely stated laws. No unified view of reality is required on my understanding of the prophetic. We need not be fortune tellers or Max Weber's charismatic madmen. Instead, my understanding of the prophetic entreats us to what, quote, attend more fully to the concrete elements entering into the situation in which we act, end quote. In other words, the prophetic invites us to experiment, involves or entails experimentation. I'll say a little bit more about that. This view presumes that all is not settled. Matters, especially those that move us about, need tending to, and often require intelligent tinkerers. That tinkering presupposes an understanding of experience that rejects the atomistic sensationalism of older forms of empiricism for a view of experience that is a matter of our simultaneous doings and sufferings, our transactions with environments that are exacting choices from us, and those choices are transforming the environments within which we act. Our engagements with environments are experiments in varying the course of events, active attempts that test us in relation to problems faced, the outcome of which are habits that effectively orient us, at least for a moment, to our environments. Such a view urges us to jettison the illusory comfort of a single, fixed, and final good, and to, quote, transfer the weight and burden of morality to intelligence as we grapple with the messiness of our moral lives. Prophecy's role in all of this is entailed in the exercise of the moral imagination. It helps us anticipate and clarify the path ahead in order that we may intelligently redirect, if necessary, those interactions that carry us one way or another. And it is in those moments when unanticipated forces eclipse our habitual ways of living, old notions, right, fall into kind of incoherence, and we experience the irritation of doubt, right? We find ourselves in those moments in need of prophetic action, conduct reflective of efforts to imagine beyond the opacity of our current conditions in order to grasp, quote, undisclosed opportunities and to generate new ideals and ends that further human flourishing. It's a pedagogical function. I want to democratize the prophetic, to bring it down to the ground, to insist that we all have the capacity to engage in prophecy insofar as we all have an occasion in the exercise of critical intelligence to envisage an as yet realized possibility in the context of efforts to secure and expand those ideals that animate our form of life. The prophetic within inquiry, then, is not about a commitment to a specific blueprint, but rather it entails a commitment to imagining effective possibilities beyond the limitations experienced. And I want to say that this comes out of my reading of African-American historical sources. What does it mean for someone who is enslaved to imagine oneself beyond that condition? I'm often fond of telling my students that there was nothing about the condition of the enslaved to lead her to believe that she could be anything else but a slave. Right? There's nothing about it. So what has to happen? The enslaved has to find, through the imagination, an ability to see beyond the opacity of her current condition and to imagine a life otherwise. And then that imaginative leap, right, affords a different orientation to the now, to the actual. Thomas Alexander has it right, I think, the philosopher. He says, imagination is a phase of activity in which possible activities are envisaged in relation to our situations, thereby amplifying the meaning of the present and creating the context from which present values may be criticized, thus liberating the course of action itself. Moral imagination is temporally complex in operation in the present, establishing continuity with the past, anticipating the future, so that a continuous process of activity may unfold in the most meaningful and value-rich way possible, end quote. Moral imagination in its prophetic form affords us the possible distance necessary to say with fire and strength what is wrong with our current social arrangements and to forecast the emergence of more just arrangements. It is a reflection upon limits and prospects. It can be a call to pursue idealized ends and a claim about the animating values of our form of life that may require us to risk everything in their pursuit. I don't need someone authorized by forces beyond my lived experience to come tell me that. It's in me. It's in you. It's in us. Imagination involves also, I believe, our capacity to see the possibilities interwoven within the actual. It is, to echo Shelley, the chief instrument of the good. Imagination is that feature of deliberation or inquiry that guides our attention beyond the immediately experienced so that we can take heed of those lessons in the past as we take in those as yet realized possibilities that attend any problematic situation. It is in this sense that moral imagination acquires its prophetic quality, that the sense of the as yet realized possibility that may indeed be realized, in contrast to the actual conditions of living, that imaginative leap can then be the basis of criticism of current social and political arrangements, and perhaps more importantly, can be the basis of a passionate creation of a self beyond the confines and strictures of the world we presently inhabit. Not only are we imagining beyond the constraints of now as a way to address social ills, we are engaged in becoming the kinds of persons that imagined world requires. Now, why is all of this important? It is precisely in this moment that we mustn't relinquish our responsibility to imaginatively address the crisis in American democracy we face today. We can no longer pine for a prophet to lead us to the promised land, or political saviors who will once and for all vanquish the evil that threatens to consume. All of these are rituals of abdication, it seems to me. Instead, I believe we must understand that, as it has always been, right, we are the serpents in the current. We are the current serpents in the garden. That we have to become better people. And it's through that effort, the imaginative leap, that we can create a better world and to become better people. We have witnessed over the last 40 years, I believe, the disintegration of any robust sense of the public good in the USA. As a political and economic philosophy has reduced us to self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends, in competition and rivalry with others, the neoliberalism that Dr. Giroux has written so powerfully about, the sphere of our moral concern has narrowed to only those who are considered one of us. Many have retreated into their silos, blinkered, festering in a cesspool of grievance, hatred, and fear. In some ways, this was the reaction to the efforts in the mid-20th century to expand who mattered in polity. Some abandoned the public domain and sought to build a world apart from historically marginalized others, and we are fighting that battle today as we face an all-out effort in the United States to relitigate the gains of the 60s, from voting rights to women's rights to LGBTQ plus rights. And if we're honest, we must admit that we've been in this battle since the founding of the American Republic. It is what Frederick Douglass referred to as the horrible reptile coiled up in the nation's bosom. This idea that some people are valued more than others has blocked the way to the beloved community, has distorted and disfigured the moral sense of so many Americans. It has made a mockery of our claims to liberty and democratic freedom. And I think as a result, we must imagine how to be together differently. And that, to my mind, is a prophetic act in which each of us is capable. Now, I've found resources over the years in the American dissenting tradition, examples of everyday ordinary people under different material conditions, fighting for an idea of community that affirmed the dignity and standing of everyone, no matter the color of their skin, their zip code, gender, who they love, or their ability. An idea of democracy close to the ground, where we are the leaders we've been looking for, where it is in our actions that the benevolent and beloved community is made possible. James Baldwin has helped me understand that intimate relationship between our broken world and our broken selves. That if we are to imagine a benevolent community, if we are to build one, we have to confront our own wounds and terrors. We have to become better people. And that sounds a bit cliche, but I think it is a central insight beyond ideological musings or virtue signaling that if we are the leaders we've been looking for, we have to reach for higher forms of excellences in our individual lives with others. And one of the central claims of We Are the Leaders is that we need to think of self-cultivation, not as a narcissistic enterprise, but self-cultivation in the pursuit of a more just world as a critical feature of any progressive vision. Right? We have to become better people in our struggle for a better world. It's very difficult to become better people when the world is organized in the way ours is, when all the rewards, right, are for the distortions, right, that in some ways make us bad people. Now, in 1962, and I've been taking too much of your time, I'm going to try to do this in 30 minutes, so I got 6 minutes left. In 1962, James Baldwin published in the New York Times Book Review an essay entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. There he wrote, quote, "The effort to become a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. We must," as Baldwin put it, quote, "deal with what words hide and what they reveal." End quote. This is all the more important in a country like our own, where our stories obscure the horrors of what we've done and ensure our sense of innocence and inherent goodness. And here I'm speaking as an American, of course. Telling the truth here in the United States, especially in dark times like our own, requires a kind of courage and commitment to shatter national illusions that offer safety and comfort. Requires a kind of risk associated with the charismatic madmen that Weber talked about, yes? It involves risking it all in moments like these in order to release us into new ways of being together. And this will entail at times a withering criticism of the past that haunts and constrains, a scathing critique of our self-conception, a critique of who we are, how we became who we are, in order to release us into a different kind of future, a pedagogical practice with a prophetic inflection. Baldwin insisted that we ask the hard question, how shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? He understood the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involved what we tell ourselves, for example, about black and white people in this country, that white people ought to be valued more than others. And we witness the monstrous consequences of what follows from this view in terms of our dispositions and practices, and we see it in the haunting spectacles of black grief and death. And in this moment of crisis today, we see in real time the reassertion of the lie. We see it not just in Trumpist affirmations of American virtue, but in the attacks on immigration, in the debates around history, and in the attack on so-called critical race theory, and the attack on women's ability to choose, in that assault on the second reconstruction of the mid-20th century, in the assault on democracy itself. In the United States, we prefer our lies straight, no chaser. What does it mean to be prophetic in this moment? What does it mean to offer a prophetic stance, a prophetic witness in this moment? Not to look for some prophet from on high, not to look for some hero to resolve the issue, not to outsource our responsibility to someone else. What does it mean for each of us to take on the prophetic role in a moment when lies have overwhelmed so much of our idea of the good? We have to admit that the trouble is deeper than we wish to think, because the trouble is in us. Remember I said earlier that we are the serpents in the garden? As a nation, America stands on a knife's edge. The background conditions that make our democracy possible have cracked wide open. We have to dare to be otherwise, to be prophetic close to the ground. We must risk everything to put the sin of racism and greed and selfishness behind us and figure out how to be together differently. And that will be hard work. We have to tell the truth as we see it, and then a little bit more, uproot the practices that the color of one's skin, the practice that the color of one's skin determines one's value. Challenge the world that has been made in that image. Enact a way of being together, a way that emerges organically from the rich diversity that gives this country life. In as much truth as one can bear, Baldwin wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced, end quote. Such powerful words for us in the United States, and I believe for you too. We cannot stick our heads in the sand this time. We cannot tinker around the edges. We must shake loose from the shibboleths of the past and their gods. We must become the prophets. No matter what has been done, no matter the death that shadows our steps, we cannot turn away from our responsibility. We have to imagine a new world. We have to imagine a world in which everyone can actualize their talents and capacities, can become who they imagine themselves to be. We cannot turn away from our responsibility. As Baldwin put it in his novel, Just Above My Head, quote, responsibility isn't lost, it's abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, one begins again. No more, right? If one refuses abdication, one begins again. Baldwin says, do your first works over. That's why we have to always return to the past, because the present is in dire need of an account of itself, right? We have to tell ourselves a different story. We have to, find resources to imagine the possible in light of the actual, which is an all-out, or involves, in part, an all-out assault on our imaginations. Huh? No more prophets descending from mountaintops with the law in hand. No more prophets descending from mountaintops. No more prophets speaking truths that aren't revisable. No more prophets telling us to lay down our burdens and to follow them. Instead, you and I, ordinary people, must strike the blow for freedom in the face of a world that insists that we all become like sacks and stomachs, to use Emerson's phrase. But if this is to be so, as William Faulkner suggested, we must not forget the problems of the human heart. Remember my worry, my ambivalence around a common faith, that Dewey's not attentive enough to the cry for help, to the vulnerability, to the wounds and brokenness of everyday ordinary folk. We mustn't forget the fears that drive us to idols. The fear and the desire for the comfort or the illusion of safety that send us barreling towards the comfort, the security of prophets and heroes, right? If we forget that, if we do, our griefs, quote, as Faulkner wrote, our griefs grieve on no universal bones, leaving no scars. Our imaginations become surfaced and barren. We write, quote, not of the heart, but of the glands, end quote. We mustn't forget the problems of the human heart. Each of us is called to bear witness and to imagine a new humanity close to the ground. If it's close to the ground, it's going to have to grapple with the messiness of who we are. We're all broken, wounded in some sort of way. We have to become dream warriors, dream prophets, to risk everything right now in this moment to make the world new. We're called, each of us, I think, to be that inexhaustible voice, to exhibit the spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance, and with the power, the prophetic power of the moral imagination to call forth a new way of being human in this world. Thank you so much.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you, Dr. Glaude. I'm so sorry my video link decided to go on holiday today,
No
but it is
worries.
but it has been an honor to meet you and an absolute pleasure to listen to you. And I wanted to pick up, if I could, on some of the comments you made toward the end of your presentation, focusing on one of the key themes in We Are the Leaders, which I would recommend everybody read. It was just a delight, as my colleague and friend Henry Giroux said, to make one's way through this wonderful book. We know that throughout the course of American history that ordinary people have done extraordinary things
Right.
through their words and through their deeds. But at a time now when America finds itself at a very dangerous crossroad, it seems that courage, whether it's coming from our leaders or coming from ourselves, ordinary citizens, seems to be in rather short supply. It's understandable. Uh, Tensions in the United States have become more pronounced. The country has become increasingly polarized. But at McMaster, we've just, begun a new program in leadership and civic engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And as I often say to groups, leadership takes tremendous courage. It takes inner strength. It takes compassion and passion. So my question for you is, based on your extensive reading of religion and history and African studies, and where does this courage really come from? And what needs to happen for ordinary people to finally stand up and say, the kind of toxicity that we are witnessing daily must stop? And as I said to a group of people the other day, when I think about the Republican and Democratic parties, I see two tectonic plates moving toward each other. And regardless of the outcome of the election next week, those 75, probably more million people who end up supporting Donald Trump are not going away anytime soon. So that energy's got to be released, as we know through our understanding of geological plates.
Mm-hmm.
Where do people summon the courage to say enough is enough?
It's difficult, Doc, to identify the place from which courage emerges, the moment in which it's expressed. We do know that history is replete with examples of people in unexpected moments exhibiting extraordinary courage in the face of tremendous costs and danger to their lives. I'm just thinking about sharecroppers in the Delta of Mississippi who dared to register to vote, understanding they would be kicked off the land, that their families would be in danger, and they did it anyway. Not to say that all of them did it. Of course, there were others who, not necessarily who were cowardly, but they were certainly prudential in the way in which they responded. And oftentimes, in our own kind of moment, we lose sight of the courage of so many people in the context of Black Lives Matter not too long ago, as in the United States in particular, as the pandemic was ravaging the country. We saw the public lynching of George Floyd, and then we saw this extraordinary outpouring of folk in the streets pushing and prodding and demanding, only to find themselves captured by a problematic representational politics. We can get into that. But we saw in that moment political energy, right? The possibility of movements.
Yes.
So I think the answer to the question is that, you know, there was this kind of moment of demobilization in the midst of the backlash that was Trumpism. And I think the combination of exhaustion and a sense of trying to figure out how do we respond has led some to believe that people have capitulated to the moment. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of stuff happening in the United States. So I think part of the task of organizers is to create the conditions under which that courage can be expressed, right?
Right.
And I think but instead that's hard to do when organizing, or some organizers have as the object of their organizing elections, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So we keep placing so much burden on elections that we almost set up the conditions for demobilization and demoralization, right, as a kind of eternal return of our politics. But that's a different story.
Henry, if I could just make one
Henry has to turn on his mic.
Okay. One follow-up. You talked about the moral imagination. I wonder where the political imagination has gone. At times of crisis, at times of not understanding a country's true identity, where do we look? To whom do we look? Perhaps, aligned with your thesis, we look to ordinary people. But where has the political imagination gone, and how can we recover it?
Well, the verb recover is really important, or reactivate. I can talk about this in the context of African American politics in the United States. What we've witnessed over the course of the mid-20th century and into the 21st century is a narrowing of the range of what constitutes acceptable forms of political dissent. And we could tell a story about how that happened. I mean, you imagine the early parts of the 20th century, you have a landscape full of very interesting people. You got Garveyites, you have Black communists or Black socialists, you have Black liberals, you have Black internationalists in interesting sorts of ways who are not tethered to the ideology of communism, but you have a Black nationalists who aren't Garveyites. You have an interesting kind of landscape of Black political options as folk are trying to imagine what freedom might look like. And now what we've seen, and this is a part of the consequence of the Cold War, consequence of kind of funneling of Black political ambition into the Barack Obama campaign. I think Adolph Reed has written beautifully about this, although I disagree with him on certain issues. And that is, the debate is narrowed to within the confines of of liberalism itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's, how does one situate oneself within the Democratic Party? And one begins to think about, what are the options, right? What are the options? Because all other forms of dissent are immediately disciplined or dismissed. And so the question is, how do we find the space and the courage to reactivate those political resources? So part of that involves telling thicker stories, more complex stories, and disrupting, right, the disciplining work of, say, Black liberalism in my context, in the context of the United States, because it's ongoing. This disciplining work is ongoing, right? To say this is not adequate forms of dissent. Just think about the way many people narrate the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. You got the height of the civil rights movement, and then you got this narrative of declension, right? And the narrative of declension is 63, King's I Have a Dream speech. And then, of course, by 65, there's the declaration of Black Power in Greenwood, Mississippi. Then there's the Black Panther Party in Oakland in October of 66. And from there, we, as Obama said on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, we lost our way, right? And that's all about kind of what? Containing a radical democratic vision. And that happens not just simply in Black politics, it happens in American politics broadly. So our task as witnesses on the page is to reactivate those stories, is to bring those resources into view in a language that is readily accessible by not only political activists on the ground, but by folks who are reading us and listening to us, I think. That's a long-winded answer, Doc. I'm sorry.
No, it was terrific. Thank you so much. Henry?
Yeah, Eddie, I want to try to enter into this conversation in a way that stresses that the political imagination precedes the moral imagination. And I want to do that by suggesting that politics often follows culture. And as Václav Havel once said, and I guess what I'm getting at is that there's an enormous tension around this question of the individual somehow becoming more social and more prophetic and assuming their own sense of agency. And yet there's very little conversation about where the sites are that both constrain agency and destroy it.
Right.
And that's a pedagogical question. I mean, in the sense that I don't understand what it means for people to attack a problem or don't understand who they are unless they first understand it in some fundamental way. In other words, you have to understand the problem before you basically, address the problem, right? So this question of mass consciousness is a pedagogical practice, and the sites in which it takes place are enormously ignored. I mean, I for one would argue, and it'd be interesting to hear your take on this. I think the left has failed terribly on this.
Yes.
They talk about economic structures, they talk about domination being limited, the power being limited to domination, but they rarely talk about what agency means in light of the apparatuses that are pedagogically shaping it, that have both been transformed and are almost overwhelming in their power. In other words, how do we talk about culture as a form of power? How do we do that? And why is it when we talk about questions of agency, we don't talk about the fact that for the last 40 years, as you have said repeatedly, we live in a culture where the notion of individualism has so limited the possibility of people understanding private issues as larger public issues that they become enormously depoliticized. And I would argue that it's in the realm of education, in the realm of shaping consciousness, and in the realm of recognizing where those spaces are that do it, that we have to begin to lend our energies. I don't think it's enough to say people should be prophetic. I think it's equally important to say, what are the conditions that prevent that, and what are the conditions that enable that? And how do we talk about both institutions and capitalism?
Right.
A site that does that. I mean, when you talk about the need for a new political imagination, how do we think otherwise in order to act otherwise? I mean, it seems to me, as somebody like Angela Davis would say, well, we really have to begin by recognizing that maybe capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. Maybe we have to begin to, in some fundamental way, imagine an educational movement that would alert people to the possibilities of their own agencies in ways in which constraints impose on choices and destroy their agency. And what are those constraints?
So let me ask you this question, Henry. I mean, because I think this is an important point, but let me ask you, because we need to think about this the scale at which you're of the understanding, right? So let me give you the example that I used was there's nothing about the condition of the enslaved that would lead her to believe that she could be anything other than a slave.
Right.
Now, does the prophetic act require that she understand slavery as a relation of domination? Does she have to understand it, its economic features? Does she have to understand the ways in which the broader, I mean, the enslaved person has to understand to a certain degree that this isn't right. Insofar as I imagine my life outside of the purview of the power of the master, that I am just simply an extension of his will, right? But beyond that, is something else required?
I think what's required is that experience, first of all, doesn't guarantee anything, as you've said repeatedly in your own book.
Right.
And I think the next step is that how does that sense of injustice be given a language that allows it to take a detour through the political that expands that sense of agency into something more than bereavement or into something more than a moral repulsion?
Right. And the thing, then the question becomes, how do we sequence that, right? Because
Right.
so if we don't understand, right? So one of the things I'm trying to do is not just simply say that, I'm not trying to suggest that we all should be prophetic is enough.
Oh, no, I'm not suggesting that either.
Right, right. So part of what I'm trying to suggest is that if we reconstruct the notion of the prophetic,
Yeah.
that we don't have to look to the mountaintop for Moses to deliver us to the other side, right? As it were. But if we can look to ourselves, right? Now, what does it mean to look to ourselves requires a subsequent move.
Yeah, Eddie, that's the key.
Yes.
We look to ourselves, Eddie, in solidarity with others.
Others. Which
That's
is
it. That's the link. And if
right.
we don't make that link, then looking to ourselves in some fundamental way bears the burden of a neoliberal logic that says that all problems are individual problems.
Right, right.
And it ends, Eddie. It ends. The dream ends.
But you notice what I'm trying to do also, right? Is that there are some, and maybe this is me reading too much of the liberal John Dewey and the ways in which he thinks about
Maybe.
individualism, old and new, right? Because in some ways, I don't want to lose sight of the individual problem, because this is the way in which I set up the argument. I set up the argument by quibbling. I wish I had more time. I should have sat there a little bit, but quibbling with John Dewey's reading of A Common Faith, right? And the way in which I quibble with it is that he doesn't attend to the individualized motivation for reaching towards religion anyway, for looking for the prophet, right? It's a cry for help. It's a console. This is James's view in Varieties, right? So what does it mean to reach, to be in solidarity with others and also be attentive to the interior self, right?
Oh, no, it's a wonderful question, because it seems to me that self, in light of its connection with others, has to be able to recognize in the language of others something in which, a way in which they can recognize themselves and move beyond the self.
Now no, we're right there. That's right. We're right there. So this is the move in Begin Again. This is why Baldwin is so important for me. Because what I see Baldwin at, if we were talking Black literary studies, Baldwin is, he is kind of navigating the social realism of Richard Wright and the aestheticism of Ralph Ellison. He wants to be mindful of the material conditions of Black life, what produced bigger, but he also wants to understand what produced Richard Wright, who gave us bigger.
Right.
So there is this, that's why I kept saying we have to become better people. We can be in solidarity with each other as assholes.
Right.
And what will that generate?
Yeah.
In the context of struggle together for a more just world, that each of us can become the kinds of people that world requires. And if we don't do the hard work on our own wounds and the like, which aren't reducible to these broader structural realities that we're pointing to, right? We might lose something. You see what I'm doing? I'm trying to.
Yeah. No.
I
also want to let Don ask one more question.
I'm sorry, Don. I'm sorry, Don.
Don, I'm sorry. I love this guy. I can't tell you how much he's changed my life. And so to be in conversation and to literally see him, I'm being abusive in some ways. This is my last point, and it doesn't demand an answer. Eddie, Leo Lowenthal in the Frankfurt School did something for the both of us that we can never forget.
Right.
And they talked about the notion of social atomization.
Yes.
And they put their finger on something that is now coming back into play, and that is the false swindle of community. meaning that in this loneliness, in this isolation, the need to be with others doesn't guarantee the beloved community.
Right.
What it now seems to guarantee is a fascist community, a racist community. And so we're dealing with these tensions around community and agency and individualism and your wonderful concept of the warrior intellectual and the prophetic. And I just want to say thank you. That's all. That was just a thought. And Don, please take over.
Oh, that's so rich. Don, I'm sorry, man. I wish I could see you.
I know,
Me
Don,
too.
where are you?
My link isn't working tonight. I'm so sorry. I actually, I could ask more questions, but I'm respectful of your time. I know Henry wants to thank you formally, but let me just say once again, it has been an absolute pleasure just to read some of your work, to listen to you this evening, to connect dots that people often don't think about, and to weave a narrative that is just so deeply moving and intelligent and timely. I really can't thank you enough. I'm trained as a political scientist. I study American politics. My work is on think tanks and public policy. And as I've often said to my students, please gravitate to scholars who make their work so accessible and so important and meaningful. So to say that I have been moved by your eloquence this evening would be an understatement. So, on behalf of my colleague Henry, who I've learned so much from in a short period of time, I can understand why he is in such awe of your work and your personality. And I just hope one day our paths do cross, because I think what you've done, not only for the academic community, but for the broader community, is so significant. You are one of those people who has exhibited tremendous courage and strength, commitment and vitality. And I can't thank you enough. And when Henry recommended you to be the first inaugural lecturer, of course, I trust Henry wholeheartedly. And the more I got into your work and just sat down and started making my way through it, I could completely understand why you would be chosen first, because you've set the bar so incredibly high. So really, from the bottom of my heart, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time and expertise, and just the your engaging manner. It has meant so much to us and to all those who have viewed you this evening. So please accept my profound thanks.
Thank you. You guys made my evening. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
Eddie, we're going to bring it to an end. I just want to say you're a national treasure. Um, Thank you so much for sharing your time and your sense of commitment and providing a model for what a public intellectual really should be. And maybe that's a conversation for another time with you and I. But thanks again, Eddie. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Take care, everybody. Be safe.
You too.
Colin, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. I'm just ending